welcome to Season 7, Episode 8 of YXE Underground. I'm Eric Anderson, and welcome to Station 20 West. It's an overcast Saturday morning in late March, and the center, located on 20th Street West and Avenue South, is buzzing with activity. People have gathered to learn more about Naloxone, how to safely administer it to someone overdosing from opioids, and to talk about what can be done to help our community get through this difficult point in time. Saskatoon's drug and overdose crisis has been all over the news. A recent CBC story notes that the Saskatoon Fire Department has responded to 935 overdose incidents or suspected opioid poisonings since the start of the year. That's compared to 376 incidents in the same time period last year. The Saskatoon Library closed 2 branches for a month over safety and overdose concerns, and Prairie Harm Reduction, which we have featured on the podcast several times, temporarily paused its operations in March to give its staff an opportunity to deal with the trauma they are seeing every day in our city. I think the local media and the Hard Knocks Talks podcast have done an exemplary job of telling the stories amidst this crisis, and I struggled to find a way to get into the crisis through the podcast, but I learned about this gathering at Station 20 West and thought there might be some people who would be willing to share their stories. So my wife Jennifer and I went on this Saturday morning and we met some pretty incredible people. We also learned how to administer naloxone, which you will hear in this episode. The first person we met was Colleen Christopherson-Cote. She was holding court at a large round table when I asked if I could ask her a few questions. Colleen is the board chair for Station 20 West, and I asked her to set the scene for our listeners.
We mobilized over the last week or so in response to the closures at Prairie Harm and the public libraries, not as a gap-filling service, but as a mechanism to try to bring awareness to the fact that there's a crisis in town, and to try to get out as many people across the city to get naloxone trained. It is sort of the front-line, bare minimum thing we can do in response to what's going on.
When you say awareness, like how important is it just to make people aware of what is happening right now in our city?
Yeah, I think people close their eyes and picture poverty to be sort of a stereotypic view of homelessness or people living on the street. And the overdose crisis is a public health crisis in this city. It's actually impacting multiple demographics. It's not just a homelessness issue.
There's lots of things that strike me about what's happening right now, but for one of them is just how quickly things have escalated. Like, has that caught you off guard in terms of how things have just gotten out of control a little bit?
I don't know if people living and working in the core neighborhood would say that it's escalated that quickly. I think we've been sounding this alarm for quite some time. I would say pre-COVID, we saw increases in homelessness and need for service use and a decline in predominantly provincial government investment. Enter COVID, that exacerbated a lot of things, and people came out of COVID without the adequate supports and services, and so this is a culmination of that timeline.
So everything's just sort of been building then?
Yeah, I think so. And then, our point-in-time homelessness count indicated about, roughly 1,500 folks. I think we've been sounding that 1,500 alarm even before that point-in-time homelessness count came out. And it's probably 2 or 3 times that at this point. It's just hard to capture because point in time is the day of, right? And so as we entered into winter and we started to see people coming and going from warming locations and having full shelters, we know that we're at sort of a tipping point for crisis around homelessness.
When you can see that coming, Colleen, and you know that like things need to be happening to help, but maybe it's not happening, like how does that make you feel?
I spent all my time in that interface between programmatic response and public policy, and a lot of folks ask that very question, like how do you keep this fight going, because it seems like it's never ending, and it is never ending. The issue is that we cannot program our way out of poverty. We cannot create a homelessness shelter and say, good, we've now cured homelessness. We need to really stop and think about what are the underlying public policies and which systems are at play here that are creating and perpetuating these cycles. I think often people talk about broken systems, and we sort of flip that narrative around and say, system's actually not broken, it's designed to do exactly what it's doing. What we're interested in is talking about how the outcomes are unacceptable at this point, and if the outcomes are unacceptable, then the system has to change.
I was just about to say, if the outcomes aren't working, then it's the system, isn't it?
It is the system. And so if you think about where folks come and go from this building, frequently, I would say weekly, if not daily, folks come to this building, Station 20 West, discharged from health with no plan, discharged from justice with no plan, discharged from foster care with no plan, discharged from hospital in their hospital gown, showing up in this building with no clothing, no shoes, no plan. Those kind of discharge services and release from systems policies need to change. There's no reason why health is medically discharging to nothing every day in this city. And I'm not saying health needs to house people, because health is very expensive. I don't want you to house people in the health system, because that will backlog health. But how do we weave a response together where community, health, social services, and all the ministries play a role in making sure there's not that giant gap?
Is it hard to get everyone at the table to talk about these types of things?
It's hard because people are really siloed in their workload, right? And so health will say, well, housing is a Ministry of Social Services issue, and people will say, well, housing is a municipal issue, and it's actually not jurisdictionally municipal in this province. And so there's a lot of disconnect around whose jurisdiction is what. And rather than fighting over jurisdiction, can we all just come to the table and say that what is happening is not okay, and who has what levers to make change? And that's what needs to happen in the next, it needed to happen 4 years ago.
Yeah. Are you, on a day like today, when you are I think what you're doing here is so great. Does it give you optimism going forward that meaningful change can happen?
Yeah, I think interesting thing about this building is when folks come from different areas of the city and have never been down here, they're caught off guard by how thriving the community actually is down here. I think they think that it's a bit of a wasteland or it's a scary place to be, and you look around and it's community practitioners and community members who all just want to be living in a thriving community like everybody else. And so the more we can have folks from across the community, other neighborhoods in this space, the better, and the more we change awareness around it not being like a stereotypic scary space to be.
I think that's such a good point, because a few months ago I did an episode with the team at Quint, and they took me for a walk all through the neighborhood and talked about the challenges, but how Quint is working to meet those challenges. But just spending an hour walking in the neighborhood, excuse me, it changes perspective. There's lots of great things happening in the community.
Yeah, so we have a free lunch coming, so you'll start to see community folks come. We can't open this building and not provide food. There's folks that are hungry, right? It's not a food insecurity response, it's a hunger response. Food insecurity is fixed through an income response, but we have a duty to provide people who are hungry food, and so that will come. And as soon as food comes into this building, you start to see this real heartbeat of community arrive. And when you break bread with people and learn their stories, it's hard to hold a stereotypic, deeply rooted hate perspective. Those things start to flow out the building, and people start to realize that actually this is part of their responsibility as well.
It's crazy too how food can just spark good conversation, can't it?
Yeah, especially good pizza, right? Yeah. Exactly.
Colleen, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Go in there, and you're going to push that plunger down. Push, push, push until you hear a click.
Okay.
There's a group of 6 people huddled around a table on the other side of the room. That's where Mary Ellen Gibson is demonstrating how to safely administer Naloxone.
Just a regular garbage can or back into your kit to dispose of. But today we have a sharp spin, so you can toss it in there. Isn't that
She's an excellent communicator, and you can tell right away how much this work means to her. Mary Ellen is a doctoral candidate at the University of Saskatchewan's Sociology Department and did her Master's of Public Health here in Saskatchewan. She is a Naloxone trainer and jumps at the opportunity to challenge stereotypes when it comes to drug use, and especially harm reduction.
Another minute or two, you can give them the third dose. I think when we talk about harm reduction, we think of sterile needles, we think about the consumption site, all of these things in our community, but harm reduction is so much more than that. Harm reduction really, as a public health idea, is understanding that everyday life has harms or potential risks to it, and we do things every single day to try and minimize those risks, whether that's wearing sunscreen to prevent getting a sunburn or potential skin cancer, or wearing a seatbelt to prevent the impacts from a car accident. So harm reduction when it comes to drug use is just another step in that. So I think having people realize that we're using harm reduction every day, it's not too tricky of a concept, and it's something that kind of just makes sense for a lot of folks, I think is a first step in us opening those conversations.
As a redhead, I appreciate the example you just used about sunscreen.
Oh, me too, as a fair-skinned person. Oh my goodness. Also, my younger self, I wish I would have listened to it a lot more.
I know. 10-year-old Eric should have used a lot more SPF 50. At an event like this, Mary Ellen, when people come to you, like you just had a table of like 4 people learning to use Naloxone, are they, like, what kinds of questions do they have of you when they're learning to use Naloxone?
I think, honestly, some of the biggest questions are, when should I use this? When do I know that it's the right time to use it? And I think when we talk about drug poisonings and toxicity, it's a little bit tricky because that person may just be unconscious and unresponsive. And so there's a lot of fear. Like, even with first aid, sometimes we don't necessarily want to give that to someone who doesn't want it, and especially when we're talking about an injection, right? So I think that's one of the biggest questions, and understanding that naloxone does not have negative side effects if someone doesn't have opioids on board is a big thing. So if someone's having a different medical health crisis and you give them naloxone, it's not going to do any damage, but it could potentially reverse that overdose and get someone breathing if that is what they're going through. So I would say that is one of the biggest questions, and honestly, I am thrilled to say that one of the other biggest questions we've had today is, how can I have more people in my life get this training? So we've had some people who work at different businesses, a lot of people, who just see people every day. I think we had someone who is a gas station attendant come in. We had people from churches and community groups coming in saying, I'd love to have more people in my community trained. Like, how can we do that? How can we get more kits out? And I think that's honestly one of the best questions we can get today.
Does that give you optimism moving forward, the fact that there are so many people in the community that want to learn this vital skill?
I think so. I think, like, in the community sometimes when it comes to the core neighborhoods or folks who may be using more substances in certain community organizations, we often feel very alone. And I know the folks who are using feel very alone and maybe ostracized or alienated. So to have so many diverse people from across the city and from such different backgrounds coming in and wanting to be a piece in solving this puzzle and supporting each other, I think is just amazing to see. And I think, again, that also breaks down some of those stereotypes that we all really do care about each other, and this is one way that we can really easily carry a kit, get trained, and we could save each other if we need to.
Mary Ellen, why does this work mean so much to you?
I think, honestly, my motivation for anything that I do is, in my opinion, caring about other people and wanting to hear their stories and connect on a human level shouldn't be a radical idea. And so I think that maybe empathy was instilled in me at a young age and very loudly, and I think that's just what drives me, is getting to witness that empathy in other people, getting to challenge those ideas in a loving and caring way, and connecting with others, I think, is really what does it for me.
The final person I meet at Station 20 West is Barbara Fornsler. She is an assistant professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Saskatchewan and, like Mary Ellen, is a naloxone trainer. You will hear Barbara teach my wife and I how to administer naloxone in just a few minutes, but I started our conversation by asking why she wanted to be at Station 20 West on this Saturday morning.
Mostly, I wanted to make sure that I've always been a bit of an advocate. Is a weird way to say it, but I often say I'm an advocate who got a hold of some academic credentials and has been trying to make some systems change. I care about people who use drugs. I care about families who are worried about people who use drugs and maybe have lost someone to the harms of drug use. I say every overdose and every death that we see in our community is a policy failure on behalf of public health and our larger governments, and these are preventable harms. These are preventable deaths, and so we need to be doing everything we can to stop this harm from occurring. There are many strategies that are evidence-based that we've seen, and unfortunately our leadership is not electing to employ those resources for our communities, and I think that's a real shame, and it needs to change.
When you see something like this happening in our community right now, like what's going through your mind when you see all this happening?
Well, and I think that's really it is, as a researcher, in a sense, I'm not frontline. That's part of the reason I wanted to learn to be a naloxone trainer. It's something I can do. I've had folks emailing me saying, hey, what can I do? And I'm sort of turning that back on community and saying, what can you do? What resources do you have access to? What conversations can you host? What can you share with community who are in need? And what skills can you bring to the table? And in sort of having that conversation, I thought, what? I am a naloxone trainer. This is a skill I can bring to the table, and this is something I can do right now. And if each of us takes the opportunity to do what we can, we're going to see a reduction in harms in our community. So community-wide effort.
This morning, when people are coming to see you and they're curious about and want to learn how to administer naloxone safely, what kinds of questions do they ask, or are they inquisitive? What's that like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people are really curious. It's not something that's sort of common knowledge, and I hope one day it will be. Don't get me wrong, that we'll all be like, oh yeah, naloxone, I learned to use that in grade school. That would be great. So that we're always ready to respond to the harms of opioids. Typically, folks, one of the common questions I get is, what if someone's allergic? And they're worried about inducing, anaphylaxis in someone who's maybe they misidentified or something. So that's one of the common questions. And the great news is it doesn't cause any allergic reaction. It's more of I call it like a shield medication, where it's knocking that opioid off the body's receptor and it's covering that receptor up, but it's not actually doing anything itself other than acting as a shield from those opioids reattaching. So that's the great news. Even if you're wrong, it causes no harm. And that's the great thing about naloxone, in my view, is that, I don't have to know for sure that this person is having an opioid-related overdose. I can administer this, and even if I'm wrong, it's not going to cause any harm.
When you were educating the public about science things, is it hard to explain it in a way that a common person like myself who doesn't have the scientific knowledge, is that a challenge for you to explain in a way that the common folks like myself can understand?
Absolutely. I can see the concern, but yeah, you don't need high medical expertise or training in a sense to understand this. So very much anyone can learn the Heimlich maneuver if somebody's choking. Many folks are trained in CPR and that kind of stuff. So this is very similar. I think what people get most worried about is the use of a syringe and a needle, because it can be a little I've never used that before. And so it's new. And that's really the great thing about the training, is that it is new. And so we can show you how it works. You get a chance to practice, and it makes it a little less scary in the future if you ever did have to use naloxone to assist someone. So hopefully we're dispelling some of that fear, and we're making it a little more approachable through events like this one.
That is just such a wonderful segue to what I'm hoping you can do for my wife and I right now. Can you teach us how to safely administer naloxone?
100%. I'm happy to be doing it, and hopefully, if it's easy to set your mic somewhere here, we can just record the whole thing.
Okay.
Right on. All right, so one of the most important things is to be able to try and identify the signs of an overdose, right? And typically that's going to be, someone being non-responsive. You're giving them a shake, you're saying, hey, wake up, Bob. If you know their name, use it. And sometimes folks given a shake will just wake up and be like, what? I was napping, and you're going to be like, whew, good, I don't need to use naloxone. But that person's non-responsive. You might see a little bit of blue if their breathing is slowed down. You might notice really slow breathing or a bit of gurgling in the breathing, and that's that person trying to take in air. What's happening with opioids is they're basically, when they sit on our receptors, they slow down the central nervous system. It's why we often hear it called a depressant, right? You're depressing the function of that central nervous system, versus stimulants, which increase that activity of the central nervous system, right, or uppers. So opioids are a downer. They come in many forms. You may have heard of fentanyl or carfentanil, oxys, these kinds of things. I've been around for a while, heroin and stuff, but where we're seeing a lot of harm right now in the community is that fentanyl, often we don't know if it's in a substance that someone might be using, so we often call that a drug poisoning, because it was, they didn't expect that. They might have been thinking, I'm going to, use some cocaine tonight. Turns out there's fentanyl in there, and suddenly they're in trouble, right? So they have none of that tolerance for opioids at all. And additionally, when we have an unregulated drug market, the strength of various fentanyl, even if you are seeking fentanyl, you may not know how strong it's going to be or how big a dose you're taking. Even if it looks to be the same amount as you took last time you used it, it could be a very different amount. So that's putting folks at risk, really, in their use. And so what we want to do is try and, be aware. If you are going to use any drug, whether it's an up or downer, no matter what you think you're using, make sure to have a naloxone kit and someone with you who knows how to use that kit. because we just don't know with the unregulated market. It's not like going to a pharmacy, right? So you may have a risk of harms there that you weren't really expecting, and so we want to be able to respond whenever that happens, right? And that's why we want naloxone. So what's happening is that central nervous system, when you've taken an opioid, is slowing down. And that central nervous system controls our breathing, right? So we just automatically breathe on our own. That's your central nervous system hard at work. That's wonderful. But when that starts to not work, that's where we run into problems. So most of the harm from overdose is related to deprivation of oxygen. And that can also cause, it's suffocation, basically, that's happening because your body has stopped automatically breathing. And so it's like you're so relaxed that you're just not breathing anymore. And that's where we want to start responding, obviously, because that lack of oxygen is what's going to cause the long-term potential brain injury. It may cause death as well. So we want to make sure that we're trying to give people oxygen as we're administering the naloxone as much as we think of it. Okay, so basically signs of oxygen deprivation can be that non-responsiveness, that blue around the lips or blue on the fingertips, or like real big signs. Sometimes if you can open the person's eyes, you're going to see really small pupils. But again, not all of these signs have to be there. That slow breathing, you might hear gurgling as they're trying to breathe, but it's really depressed. So typically someone's breathing, taking a breath in every 5 seconds or so. If it's longer between those breaths, or if they seem to be struggling to take that air in, that can be a sign of an opioid-related overdose. So not all those signs have to be present all at once. You don't have to be like, well, their pupils aren't dilated, so I won't go ahead. So you just, in my view, is the person responding? Can you wake them up? If the answer is no, you can probably go ahead with naloxone. Great thing again about naloxone is that it's not going to cause any harm. It interacts with only opioid-based drugs. So if there was something else going on, it's not going to cause or interfere. It's not going to cause harm or interfere with other medications. So that person, we've identified, hey, Bob's not responding here, and everyone, I always use Bob as a generic name. Anyway, but Bob's not responding. I've given him a shake. I've said, hey, Bob, wake up. Sometimes we can do that sternum rub to try and stimulate. So if someone's napping and you take your knuckle and push into their chest really hard, they're going to wake up. It's uncomfortable, right? It doesn't feel good. And they're going to say, stop that, But if they don't say that, then probably we're in a situation like that. You might also see, different paraphernalia around, like maybe somebody's got pills beside them or a pipe in their hand or this kind of thing. There might be other indicators of substance use. Not always, by any means. Lots of times folks will use. And then maybe they're walking away from that and going for a walk downtown, and it sort of hits them a little bit later. Some of the challenge with opioids and benzodiazepines, which they've been finding at PHR through their drug testing, is that it can magnify the effect, but it can also delay the impact of overdose. So someone might appear to be okay, and then it's 20 minutes later that they're actually starting to struggle with that breathing and things like that. So it may not be as immediate as I just take this drug and then I drop. Sometimes that happens, but sometimes it can be a delayed onset. So there may not be signs around the person that they've used. So we want to just try and say, hey, is this person, can I wake them up? If the answer is no, and you're pretty sure it's opioid related sort of thing, even if it's not, I say assume it's opioid related, especially at this time in our community where we've been seeing so many calls for overdose and drug related harms. So we've determined that. So first thing, I'm giving them a shake. I'm going to check their airway, just make sure that there's not like a hot dog or something in their throat, right? So if there was, I'm going to remove that if I can, and I'm going to hopefully give them a rescue breath and try and get them breathing again. But assuming that's not happened, I'm going to assume it's an overdose, and I'm going to start to administer naloxone. So what I'm going to do is dial 911 on my cell phone. I'm going to put that on speaker. The great thing about 911 and emergency response is I might be a civilian panicked in the street sort of thing going, oh my God, what do I do? I may not remember everything that I'm learning here today. That's okay. 911 can talk you through each step of this administration, and so it's great to have that advocate on the phone with you. So they're going to dispatch those first responders as quickly as they can, which is wonderful. In the meantime, you're going to set that phone down so you've got your hands free, and you're going to open up your naloxone kit. And in each kit, we've got 3 vials of naloxone, so that's 3 doses, and we've also got 3 of these handy Vanish Point syringes. And so these are all sterile, and basically what the great thing about the Vanish Point is you don't have to have a sharps disposal bin. When you finish the injection, the needle itself actually retracts back into the syringe, and so it doesn't require fire a sharp spin. You can get rid of it, and there's no risk of poking, yourself or someone else with it once it's been used. So that's super handy. Also in these kits, we've got rubber gloves, gloves to protect yourself and others. Now, that was a big myth that went around for a long time, that if you touched fentanyl, you could overdose. That is not true. No study has shown that to be true. Actually, touching fentanyl would be the least effective way of ingesting it. So it would take a long time. You'd need sweaty palms. You'd need to be rubbing it. It would take a lot of active effort to actually have that happen. So if you ever did get fentanyl or an unknown substance on your hands, you want to wash that off your hands, as soon as possible. Maybe don't stick your fingers in your mouth and try and ingest it. But basically, if you got a bit on your hands, it's not going to cause harm to you. So we just advise, wash your hands as soon as you can, sort of thing. But don't panic. It's not going to cause an overdose for you as a responder. So that's important to know. But we do have these gloves if you're feeling like you need to use them. And there's also these alcohol swabs contained here, and that usually should be used. If you've got someone in short sleeve shirt or a tank top, and there's a lot of dirt or mud or something on them, you want to use that just to clean that spot where you're going to give that injection. Though typically in an emergency situation in Saskatchewan, it's winter most of the year. Folks are going to be wearing jackets, and the great thing about these Vanish Point is that you can inject right through the clothing that someone's wearing as long as it's sort of thin, so like their pants, right? We want to aim for a muscle group that's like the thigh, the butt, or the upper arm sort of thing. But usually if we're in a jacket and all that, taking the time to strip someone down and try and find that can be extra seconds where that person's not breathing. So my advice is to go right through the clothing of the leg on the thigh. That's the most accessible. Check for keys. Make sure there's not an object that's going to block that syringe from getting in. But typically, if you don't have pockets there, you're going to be good to go. So importantly, we've got all these things in our kit. That's great. We've also got a breathing mask, and that's what's really also important. The big harm here is lack of oxygen. So what we're going to do is put this one-way breathing mask on the person. So you're going to basically put this in their mouth, and then this gives you a place to breathe into their mouth. And because it's a one-way valve, if they splutter or air comes back out, you're not at risk of getting anything coming back at you. So that one-way mask, you're going to put it on their face. Again, 911 is going to be talking you through all these steps as you go. So if you don't remember,
but you're doing an amazing job, Barb.
I hope it makes sense. And I hope I just hope folks remember rescue breath, get the naloxone into the person. Those are the two key takeaways from all of it, right? So you're going to give that rescue breath, and you've already called 911. So that those first responders are on the way. You've got them on speakerphone, and they're going to be assisting you, so you're not alone in this response, right? So we're going to give that rescue breath. Sometimes folks will wake up with one rescue breath and they'll be like, oh, what happened sort of thing. But you're trying to stimulate them, get their central nervous system going again, right? Typically that first breath is just going to help mitigate the damages of the lack of oxygen. And we're going to start loading up our naloxone. So what we're going to do is pull that naloxone out of the kit. Again, you got those 3 vials, and basically they're these glass vials. So what also comes in your kit are breakers. And basically this is a way, you can break this with your bare hand if you had to. If you didn't have a breaker, that it's possible to just snap it open. But we want to give it a swirl. See how that naloxone's sitting up there at the top there? We want to try and get that down. So giving it a swirl or a hit, eventually it usually goes down. Sometimes it's picky, but we want as much as we can. So I've given that a big shake. It should be good enough. Then I always say, because you're an all-star for learning to use naloxone, you're going to take that star side of the breaker, and that's the side that's going to go down over the bottle. And then you're going to break this open. So I'm not going to use this naloxone just expired. That's why it's now my demo kit, but we're going to do this with the training. People often worry, they're like, why are you wasting naloxone on training? I'm like, no, this is saline. This is not actually naloxone that we're training with today. So, but I always appreciate that folks want to save resources. So I've given this swirl. I'm going to take that, because you're an all-star, putting that star down so it's sitting comfortably on top. And then I'm basically, if you have time to find the blue dot is where you want to push, but you can push in any direction. It's not super solid. So I'm going to break this open. You hear that little snap?
Yes.
Now I've got access to the naloxone that's inside. One of the great things about these little vials is if you knock it over, typically, okay, we had a little bit of a spill, but most of it stays in. And that's just the surface tension that keeps it in the vial. So if you knocked it over by accident, oh no, a little bit spilled out, but not most of it, so that's great. You can still use what's in the vial. Do not try, sometimes folks are like, should I pick up the rest with my syringe? No. Anything that's touched the ground or another surface is now contaminated. We don't want to be injecting that into anyone. So we only want to use what remained in the vial, and most of the time the surface tension will keep everything in the vial. Every time I demonstrate it, it comes out of the vial, but that's important. So then I'm going to take my Vantage Point syringe, and basically it's just like a cheese string, right? You just peel it open, or a bandage sort of thing, so it's super easy. If you can't find the end, this is also just paper. If you have like a nail or whatever, you can rip it open yourself, but I would say think of the cheese string, peel it open. So that's going to get your syringe and your needle out, and basically sometimes these things stick a little bit, so I sometimes give them a bit of a pull so that I can get that moving a little bit. And then I'm going to uncap it. So I've got that sharp needle ready and exposed. I'm going to put that needle into the vial, right down at the bottom, and then I'm going to draw it up. And I say, often holding it like this, we often don't have tables in the middle of a street kind of thing, so it can be hard. But if you need to set it down and use 2 hands to draw it up, that's okay too. So basically I'm holding this needle almost like I might want to stab someone with it, and I don't want to do that just yet anyway. And I'm going to draw this up. Using my thumb.
Do you draw the whole vial up?
I do, yes. You take everything you can get out of this vial, and then you might hear a bit of a, let's see if I can, it's not making that, sometimes you hear a when you get it all. It's kind of like opening a can of cola. But in this case, no, it was decided to be quiet, probably because we're recording. So basically now I've got all my naloxone out of that vial, and it's in the syringe. You're going to see a bunch of air in there with it as well. Typically, that's okay. This isn't the movies. You're not going to cause someone to have a heart attack with an intramuscular injection if you get air in them. If there's some air, so we want to push that out as much as we can. But the worst thing air will do with an intramuscular injection is cause a little bit of a bruise in the person. So again, not the movies. Don't worry. We're not expecting medical accuracy of finding a vein and doing all this sort of stuff that we see in movies. Not needed. So importantly, I'm going to push out as much air as I can. But again, if there was a bit of air in there and I put that in someone's thigh as an intramuscular, worst that's going to happen is they're going to get a bruise on their thigh. So it's okay. Again, no permanent harms. So now I've got this ready to go. And what I want to do is in that thigh, butt, or upper arm, what we need is a muscle group. And typically, the thigh is going to be the most accessible. I'm going to check for keys on that thigh, and then I'm going to, at a 90-degree angle, I'm going to put this syringe right in until that syringe, so the needle's totally in, and you can see that the syringe is touching, basically, the very surface there. And then I'm going to deploy that naloxone. I'm going to push down on this plunger till all that naloxone's in. And then I'm going to give an extra push, and that needle is going to retract back up into the syringe itself, and now there's no more sharp, and we're good to go.
Barb, what were you just demonstrating on?
Oh, I am using currently a stress ball that is a happy face stress ball. We have a variety. We know it's a really serious topic, right? But sometimes it makes it a little more approachable if you've got, a unicorn or Loch Ness monster that you can inject the naloxone into as your practice. And it makes it a little bit more approachable, I think, for folks when we have sort of fun stress balls that we can use for that injection. They used to do training with oranges, but we know with food security concerns, we want to not be using food that could be donated to people in other situations. So yeah, we got the stress balls going on, and they're always very handy. So that's my first injection. I'm then going to basically evaluate again, right? I'm going to sort of say like, okay, I'm going to wait about a minute. They used to say 3 to 5 minutes before administering another shot. Generally, at this point, we're saying 2 to 3 minutes max. And I often say for us civilian responders, hey, after 1 minute, if there's no change, Bob, are you waking up? Is there anything changing here? I'm giving those rescue breaths. If I don't see any change, that person's not starting to breathe, I'm going to start loading up my second naloxone shot at about a minute. And then it's exactly the same steps that I just took before. I'm going to break that open. I'm going to draw up that shot. I'm going to get the air out of there. And I'm going to administer my second shot of naloxone. And then I'm going to wait about a minute or so. I'm going to start loading up my second shot, or my third shot at this point. And I'm going to use a brand new Vantage Point every time I give an injection, right? So that needle's gone back into the syringe, so it shouldn't be reusable, but sometimes they don't retract fully. That can happen, but don't reuse that injectable, that syringe for injection. So I've got 3 shots, and hopefully someone's going to wake up during this process, and you're giving them rescue breaths every time you think of it. And I say every time you think of it, the standard is every 5 seconds if you can. So if there were 2 of you responding, one person could be giving that rescue breath every 5 seconds while the other person is administering the naloxone. It can be hard in a panic situation, in an emergency, to remember all these things. So I just say as soon as you remember, give that breath. If you're on the phone with 911, they're going to tell you rescue breath, right? And they're going to help guide you through the administration, and they're going to be like, and now a breath, and now administration, and now a breath, sort of thing, right? So Importantly, we want to get that naloxone in to hopefully knock those opioids off those receptors and cover that receptor with a shield of naloxone so that that person then can start breathing on their own as soon as possible. If that's not working, so I've given all 3 doses, say, and that's still not working, and I've run out of naloxone, I'm going to keep giving those rescue breaths until those first responders get there, because again, the big harm here is lack of oxygen is going to cause the harm and or resulting in death sort of thing. So if I can keep breathing for them, it's more likely that they could potentially survive when more naloxone gets there. If both of you had a kit and that was handy, you could keep going with these doses and just keep administering it until you run out of naloxone. Hopefully first responders will be there before you run out of naloxone, but you can always go ahead and use another kit if you have one handy, or if somebody else had nasal naloxone handy and you've used that, then you can go to the intramuscular, or if you used up your intramuscular and then have a nasal, somebody else shows up on scene and says, hey, I've got nasal, you can go ahead and combine those things. It's okay to use both. So really the goal is to try and give oxygen to this person while they're in distress and to get those first responders there so that they can then take additional steps, add that additional naloxone, and transport that person for medical assistance.
I was just about to ask, like, if is it? I guess it depends on every person in terms of like what they were feeling like if once they wake up, I guess.
Yes. So one of the things that we heard about when naloxone was early was sort of people are really angry and this kind of thing, and I'm like, yeah, sometimes that can happen, not all the time, not with the frequency we hear reported or the fears that I hear relayed. So what can happen is if someone is dependent on opioid drugs, base class drugs, so they've been using them for a long time, their system is used to having them. What naloxone will do is basically put that person into immediate withdrawal because we're taking all the opioids out of their system all of a sudden with that naloxone. And so that person's going to be feeling very sick. They're in withdrawal and they went from being in this warm, happy place, is probably the last thing they remember, and suddenly they feel awful. So they might be like, what the heck just happened, right? And probably use different language than I have there. But really importantly, you want to stay with that person. If they do wake up, you want to explain, you had an overdose, you were not breathing, I administered naloxone, and first responders are on the way. And we want to stay with that person. We also want to let them know, using more opioids at this time is not going to do anything. That naloxone is going to block those opioids, so don't use more. Also, as the naloxone starts to wear off, they're going to start to feel better because those opioids are still in their system, and so they will reattach. So this is also a risk for, just because someone gets revived with naloxone, we want to stay with them, we want to connect them with first responders because those opioids are still in their system, and once that naloxone wears off, those opioids are going to go back onto those receptors, and they could go back into an overdose. So making sure that they've got that medical assistance to follow up is really important. So encouraging folks to wait for those first responders, telling them what happened will help mitigate some of that anger that they're feeling. However, we know folks who are, university students who are maybe not dependent on opioid drugs are also using substances in Saskatoon. That happens a lot. And what for them, in a sense, once that opioid's out of the picture, they're not going to feel sick in the same way. They're just going to feel like, oh, I can breathe now, and so they won't feel sickness. They will just feel more alert. So that's really what's going to sort of happen if somebody wakes up after administering naloxone. Might be different depending on who you're administering to, but most important thing is explaining what happened. Again, a lot of times when folks are going into an overdose, they're in a really warm, fuzzy, opioid-induced state, and they're feeling good and everything's good, and they feel a little bit sleepy, and then suddenly they're going to get rocketed out of that and might be startled by like, what happened, and they may not know what happened, basically. Typically folks, in a sense, if folks could identify in themselves that they were starting to have an overdose, then maybe they could self-administer naloxone, but that doesn't typically happen. It's usually you're feeling warm and fuzzy and like you're going to sleep, and then your breathing gets slower and slower and slower kind of thing. And that is really why we need folks, around us and in the community to respond in case of overdose. That's why we ask folks to use a very small amount if possible. Always be using with friends or family or somebody who's nearby who can respond in the case of an overdose. And a really great resource that is we're trying to get the word out about is the National Overdose Response Service, or NORS. And what this is a telephone-based service where operated by peers, so people who use drugs are typically staffing the lines, or people who used to use drugs as well, and advocates, people who care. And basically what you can do is phone and say, hey, I'm in my apartment and I'm alone and I live at this address. I'm going to use my drugs. I'm concerned that they might be contaminated or I might experience an overdose. Can you stay on the phone with me? And they'll say, absolutely. And they'll chat with you, friendly. And basically basically what their job is then is to dispatch medical frontline responders if you become non-responsive after using those drugs. So it's not perfect because they're not right there to give the naloxone right away, but it's better than nothing. And I often say something is better than nothing. So if folks are feeling like they're not comfortable, talking with their friends or family about their use, they're concerned about that sort of thing, maybe they're feeling that stigma and don't want to disclose that use, the NOR's National Overdose Response is a great resource for folks who might feel shy about it otherwise. They're not there to dispatch police or be narcs or anything like that. It really is medically focused. And the great thing about those medical responses is that we do have the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act in Canada, which means, if I'm out with my friends and we're using some drugs and there's a medical event and I call for those frontline responders and I've maybe got drugs in my pocket, so the police maybe come as part of that response, they're not allowed to charge me with possession of drugs. So I don't have to be fearful of being criminalized, and I can call for that medical support. So this helps us avoid, people getting dropped in front of emergency departments and this kind of thing. We can explain what happened, what they took, what response has been so far, and it really can help bridge for those medical providers. They can have an understanding of what's going on rather than just having a mysterious person dropped in front of an emergency department. So that's some good stuff. And yeah, once we all know how to use naloxone, I think we'll have a little bit less, hopefully people will feel better prepared to respond and be able to offer that response prior to medical support arriving.
You have been so gracious with your time. Oh my gosh, it makes total sense. And thank you for teaching Jen and I how to use naloxone. I have one quick question before I let you go. Why does this work mean so much to you?
Oh, overall, to steal from the Manitoba Harm Reduction Network slogan, I love someone who uses drugs, and I think that's many people in our community love someone who uses drugs or who did use drugs. And so ensuring that people are prepared to respond is really the key. And that's really, what brings me to this work is knowing a lot of really fabulous human beings who happen to also use drugs, and that, it shouldn't be, a death sentence to use drugs. We do need some policy change to have better responses. Things like getting nasal naloxone into the community would mean all of this training is not necessarily needed. You just basically take that nasal, put it up someone's nose, and push the plunger. So it's super easy, but it does cost a little bit more than the intramuscular kits. So things like that could be done immediately. And, longer term, we need to think about decriminalizing this health issue, right? So criminalization, trying to arrest our way out of this crisis is not going to be effective. We've had 80 years of the war on drugs, and it's brought us here, which is not helping our communities be safer and healthier. So we do need to start responding to this as the health issue that it is. That's where most substance use is rooted in not all of it's rooted in trauma, but a lot of times when people become dependent on a substance, that's a coping mechanism for other things that are going on in their life, including undiagnosed mental health concerns. So we want to have a really system-wide, fulsome response. We are very focused in this province on treatment beds and deploying more treatment beds. But what we see is that not everyone is ready for that. Not everyone wants to access that. And having what we call a continuum of care, where basically wherever someone's at in their journey, they can use in a safer way. They can be supported to make the changes they want to make, whether that's at home or in a residential facility, that we're not only focusing on that acute care, residential service, and that we have things like Prairie Harm Reduction in our community is really the key to some of the solution. And then additionally, starting to say, what does it mean to treat it like a public health issue rather than a criminal issue? Well, maybe it means providing people with a regulated alternative to the substance that they're buying in the unregulated market, right? So that what we often call it the illegal market sort of thing. And because a lot of those harms are coming from not knowing the dose and not knowing what they're taking. So if you could connect people with health professionals and say, hey, you prefer to use opioid drugs, here's a prescription of those drugs. We're cutting out that entire illegal market. We're letting them know what the dose amount is, what the likely side effects are, just like when we pick up a prescription. Anytime, you get that little pamphlet that tells you all the risks and stuff. We could send them home with a naloxone kit as well if they needed it. And basically we could mitigate a lot of these drug poisoning and overdose events by having a known dose and known substance of use. So it often sounds radical to say, hey, we need a safer supply for people who are using drugs, but that safer supply would go a long way to cut down on these acute harms and death that we're seeing in our community.
It was such an honor to meet you today.
That works. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the work that you're doing, and not only today, but clearly in the community as well.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
I'm
Barb.
happy to be doing it. Thank you so much for taking the time to have the conversation and to learn how to use naloxone and help our community be safer and healthier. I appreciate it.
This has been Season 7, Episode 8 of YXE Underground. My name is Eric Anderson. I host, produce, and edit this local independent podcast. My sincere thanks to Barbara Fornsler, Mary Ellen Gibson, Colleen Christopherson-Cote, and the entire team at Station 20 West for sharing their stories and being so welcoming to us. You can listen and follow YXE Underground wherever you find your favorite podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on the website yxeunderground.com. Please feel free to leave a 5-star review if you like what you hear. These reviews help the podcast get into more podcast feeds, so I really do appreciate the support. Find YXE Underground on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Simply search YXE Underground, and you'll see photos from this episode taken by my wife, Jen Nairn. Thank you to Saskatoon's Danger Dynamite for creating and maintaining the website. And before I go, I would like to acknowledge that these interviews were gathered on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. YXE Underground is a production of the Salthammer Production Company. My name is Eric Anderson. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you soon, Saskatoon.